Hello and a very warm welcome to everyone. You are watching the fourth dispatch in our series, India Restart, Meaningful Dialogues on India's Path to Recovery. The entire purpose behind this discussion series is to come up with some solutions and ideas on how the economy could be rebooted. The approach that we have taken is to bring new ideas, new lines of thinking on the table. Some of them could also be unconventional and also question some of the basic assumptions that we have worked with. In our last three episodes, we have dwelled deeply on topics around money creation, rebooting entrepreneurship, and so on. The topic for today's discussion is one which is increasingly gaining currency and has in fact come to the spotlight in the aftermath of the pandemic. The ongoing crisis is creating changes that could end up dividing society into pre and post COVID 19 days. These changes are also likely to only accelerate the novel challenges accompanying the fourth industrial revolution. It's not only the virus, we are also at war with the disruptive technologies ushering in productivity gains which have never been seen before. They're also steadily reducing human capital requirements, making jobs a premium. Look at Silicon Valley, for instance, with five of the world's most valuable companies with a cumulative market capitalization of $4 trillion. Yet, they only employ just 1.2 million people. Lockdown in some formats are expected to be the norm till the arrival of a vaccine. With almost chunk of India's workforce in the informal sector without minimum wage or social security, micro-level circumstances will be worse in India than anywhere else. The frequent sight of several thousands of migrant laborers undertaking perilous journeys on foot in inhumane condition is a disgraceful blight on India. One way to ensure their sustenance throughout these days is the introduction of unconditional regular paychecks at maximum universality, at least till the time economy normalizes. One way to ensure their sustenance throughout these trying times is introduction of unconditional regular paychecks at maximum universality, at least till the time economy normalizes. If universal basic ever had a time, it is now. Gentlemen, thank you for your time and energy to this. I have with me a very august panel here. Please help me welcome Pranav Bardhan, noted economist who has taught and worked in the United States since 1979. He is Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of California, Berkeley. I also have with me a very successful entrepreneur, Vinod Charakan, Managing Director of Places Technologies, a software products firm, and they have banks such as JP Morgan and Wells Fargo in the US as their clientele. They've also very closely worked with the US government on the Paycheck Protection Program. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us and putting the time and energy to this. My first question, really, the opening remarks on this entire narrative being built around UBI. Pranav, as you know, that NHRC has actually submitted a report to United Nations saying that the government is actually looking at UBI in a serious fashion. I want to understand from you what really would be your opening remarks to this, and then get on to Vinod as to what he is thinking and what are his views on the subject.
Yes, thank you. I somehow think that the universal basic income idea, which is of course a very old idea, and I have been advocating this for India more than 10 years now, but the present context is different. The present context is masses of people in India are distressed, not merely by the health crisis, but by the economic crisis. And what to do about that? Many countries, not India, have introduced cash assistance. India has given cash assistance only to the very small amount of 500 rupees per month to women, those who have Jan Dhan accounts. And that's a very small amount. In fact, survey evidence tells us that nearly 1/3 of poor women do not have a Jan Dhan account. But even so, even if all of them had the Jan Dhan accounts and got the money, that's a very small amount. So for the purpose of relief and for the purpose of boosting demand in the economy, we need cash in the hands of people. Now, is universal basic income is one way of doing it. I think of universal basic income as a more long-term or at least medium-term measure, because you need certain things to be in place institutionally, politically, policy-wise. You need something in place. We don't have that. The government, for example, wanted to, when they became aware too late to the position of the migrant laborers. They could not help them. They could not give them cash. So in India, it requires some institutional setup to start a universal basic income. But if the current cash assistance programs all over the world can graduate into universal basic income, I certainly would be happy. And as you mentioned, jobs is the main problem that is in the Silicon Valley and elsewhere. The problem is coming up looming automation and artificial intelligence. India is a much more raw problem. People just do not have even elementary, rudimentary jobs. Now, the way I think about the universal basic income is even in the long term. I'll be talking primarily in the long-term sense. Short-term, there are transitional problems, but I think of it primarily as a policy issue in income insecurity or economic insecurity. Not economic inequality as such, not even poverty, it is economic insecurity. The reason I think in terms of insecurity is that compared to those who think of this as an anti-poverty program, they are thinking of those who are below the poverty line. But even above the poverty line, hundreds of millions of people in India, their lives, economic lives are insecure. Various kinds of risks of weather, risks of illness, risks of job loss. Altogether, there are many risks. So I think of the basic income as a kind of more problem issue in getting minimum economic security. The other way I also think about universal basic income, which is somewhat different from the others, is that I regard universal basic income as a basic human right to minimum economic security. And that is not yet recognized in our country and in many countries. I think that's very important. Now, once you think of it as a right, then you can answer one of standard question that we are asked. Standard question is, oh, you want to give everybody a certain amount? Doesn't it mean you're also going to give the Ambanis that amount? My answer is yes. My answer is, that's why we call it universal. And if you look at it as from the rights point of view, then you understand it. Mr. Ambani, for example, if the state should give Mr. Ambani protection from, say, crime, because he has as a citizen, he has the basic right to get physical security. So if that is the case, because that's a basic right, similarly, economically also, everybody should have the same right. If Mr. Ambani doesn't want to take it, that's fine. But conceptually, he has the right to get it. The other issue is that let me mention, there are 4 reasons why basic income has a special case in India. Basic income, the arguments everywhere, but I'll give you 4 reasons why it's particularly important in India. Number 1, India, unlike in most countries, including many developing countries, 3/4 of adult women in India do not earn any income. So, in order to provide them some autonomy in their family, self-esteem in their family, and of course, economic security, you need to, if every month some amount is put in their bank account, that will be a big change in India. This is a special case because 3/4, as I said, of adult women in India do not have income. That's special case number one. Special case number two, there are many jobs in India which for various social reasons are stigmatized. For example, those who do manual scavenging, those who do collect our garbage, those who do clean our sewage, and sex work. These are occupations which in India are stigmatized. Now, the people do this work because they have no other alternative. If all of these people who do this work now have a basic income guaranteed to them, this might provide them a ladder, so to speak, to climb out of that stigma. So that is the second reason why it's a special case in India. A third case is that in India, even when we try to help the poor, politicians use it as part of their patronage distribution. So for example, quite often, things that citizens are entitled to, they get with, whatever they get, there will be the photograph either of the prime minister or the chief minister, as if is the patronage given by the prime minister or the chief minister of the state, as a result of which the citizen is getting that. So we have to take it out of that patronage structure, which we often do in India, and make it a universal right. So it's not, we are getting this, somebody's getting it not because the prime minister or the chief minister is giving it as a patronage, but it is our citizens' right. So that's another third case that I think we should make it as a special case for India. Fourth, unlike developed countries, unlike many other developing countries, India has a very large informal sector. About 90% of our workers are informal workers. And these informal workers do not have access to benefits, no security, no pensions, no, if they fall ill, nothing. So for them, the informal work, vast numbers of the informal workers who do not have any benefits, for them, universal basic income can provide at least some benefit, some floor to which they can turn to. So these are four special cases. Now, I want to go on to, but I wanted to ask you whether I should go on to those points later or
No,
now.
but I think that was meaningful, Pranab, and I think you sort of laid down the introductory remarks and also the what makes India a special case for universal basic income. I would like to get Vinod in now for his opening remarks,
Sure.
what he thinks. Vinod, we just heard Pranab, and he said that the concept of universality is very important. It has to be as universal as possible. And he also actually mentioned that why should Ambani's be out of the purview of universal basic income? The center of the conversation has to move from being a very patronage driven income supplement to what is the actually civil right of every individual in this country now. I wonder what is your viewpoint on this?
Right. Thank you for having me on the show, Shrija. And that was very good perspective shared by Professor Bardhan in those opening remarks. I would completely align there. I think, firstly, to quickly summarize the very definition of universal basic income, there is a reason for that first word there, universal or unconditional, right? The reason is very, very simple. If you look at all the social benefit programs in India, the most obvious one being the PDS or the public distribution system, the data is already out there. It's so obvious, right, that it doesn't make sense, because for every 1 rupee worth of services provided or goods provided to the social benefits, the actual administrative cost of the government is 3 rupees 65 paise. That will not make sense to anybody, right? But that is a fact, because the moment you try to administer a selective process, almost more than the funding provided, you spend more in trying to attempt that administration. And of course, when you try to administer a function like this, it's going to create a rent-seeking behavior. It's going to introduce new channels of corruption. So just get away from that and go universal, which makes it very simple. And I would say the biggest benefit that India has is the fact that we are one of the few countries with a very powerful identity management platform like Aadhaar. If you look at the data there, we have a population of about 1.35 billion people in the country. We already have 1.26 billion registered with Aadhaar. Now, when you look at the data, even on the Aadhaar registrations, you need to be above 5 years of age to be eligible to be part of the Aadhaar program. And we have 100 plus million people in our population, as per the statistical information already available, that are below 5 years. So what that means is we almost have universal enrollment in Aadhaar, and that mechanism makes it very simple to ensure that you can implement such a program, right? I feel the biggest issue has been, I mean, like Professor Bardhan said, this is subject has been there for a long time. So I think the biggest issue has been this question of how do you fund it, right? It's a great idea, it's a great concept, but where is the money going to come from? And I think the biggest concern that I have, to be really candid and honest, is a fundamental lack of understanding of how money works, right? Or how the economic side of money works. And what I mean there is everybody's talking about funding such a program through the fiscal tax collections of the country and such. But the government has the authority to create that money. So let me explain that a little better. You just need to look at the Western countries, and more specifically the United States, just in the last few months. And like you mentioned, my company has been playing a big part of the what is called as the Small Business Administration Paycheck Protection Program, where through a whole series of credit unions, we have been supporting the financial lending institutions in allowing small businesses having employees less than 500 to offtake of this paycheck protection program. Now, the question is, along with that and the $600 weekly checks being sent out to all citizens earning less than $75,000 in the United States, where did the funding come from? Almost more than 10% of their GDP, which is in excess of $2 trillion. And now they're talking about a second or third round, right? What people don't understand is that money is created when the central bank buys securities from the government, thus creating brand new money in the system. And India should do exactly the same. If you look at the cost, and I will take a step forward and say, we have been doing research in this area for I think close to 8 years now. And the number we've arrived at is 3,000 rupees per individual. If you have 3,000 rupees distributed per individual in this country, you're talking about an impact on the GDP of about 15%. Now, while that sounds very scary, the concept of creating 15% of new money in the system, the incremental thought is that is going to drive inflation, right? Because if you just produce new money, then it's going to dilute everybody else. But that's where I think there is a lack of understanding of basic economic concepts, because the very definition of GDP, or gross domestic product, is to divide the total spending in the economy by the quantity of products and services available in the economy. And that is how you arrive at the price of just about anything. So if you now increase the spending by creating 15% of new money, for example, as long as you have a corresponding increase in the production of products and services, you're not going to have a serious impact on the price. So that's the first point, right? That if you create new money, just be supportive of creating an increase in products and services to control inflation. But if you're distributing, let's say, 3,000 rupees to everybody in the country as an individual, like Professor Bardhan said, it could be an Ambani or it could be the poor laborer who has no food to eat, okay? Both of them should get the same, because it is not practical to administer such a process, such a solution. So the key factor on the funding side there is you can control inflation. It is not a challenge at all, because the simple question I would ask everybody is, there is a limit to how much food you can eat. If each of us get 10 times the income we have today, we are not going to buy 10 times the food, right? So our concern around inflation is around food and basic essentials that has a limit for consumption. Now, beyond that, I don't think any of us should be worried about inflation with the price of mobile phones, or inflation in the price of LED TVs, or inflation in the price of these other lifestyle options, right? The reason I say that is you can get a mobile phone for 3,000 rupees, a smartphone for 3,000 rupees, all the way to 3 lakh rupees in India. Now, you have an option and the utility is exactly the same. So we don't need to worry about inflation about anything beyond the basic food and essentials. And even for that area, there is a limit. So I would almost say, when you look at the funding side, it's a net positive, because the moment you increase spending in the country by distributing basic income through money created by the government by selling securities to the RBI, what ends up happening is you're going to boost spending and you're going to create demand. When you create demand, there's going to be the economic growth to now meet that demand. So new jobs are created. The government is going to collect new taxes. I really don't see, I mean, the only point in my mind is, I mean, we've been thinking about this for so long. My conclusion has been it's a lack of questioning the current assumptions, and it's honestly a lack of understanding the basics on the economic side. So that's what I would share in my opening remarks.
Okay, thanks, Vinod. I think both of you spoke about the eligibility, and I think there's some consensus building out there that has to be as universal as possible, as unconditional. I want to come to you, Professor Bardhan here. There's an entire argument about how do you fund this massive exercise. Vinod shared his views on what he has perhaps seen in the US as being part of the small business, protection program, and what's the kind of various structures and money creation that he has seen. Talking specifically from the Indian context, where we've also seen some welfare programs being doled out for the poor in the past also, which have not necessarily been so successful. We're talking about a very large, wide experiment here. And you have written quite a few op-eds in this direction in national newspapers in India also. What do you think are the possible ways where it can actually be funded? And what is your viewpoint there?
Yes. Thanks. You asked me that question. It so happens that whenever I've written on universal basic income, as an economist, I thought that it's my obligation to show where would the funding come from. So all my articles, I've given also a calculation of where did the money come from. Now, what Mr. Tharapan just mentioned about monetizing it essentially, I personally think that our government and the Reserve Bank are much too conservative. So on that point, I think I agree with him. But I think I will qualify it a little. What the United States can do, I think India cannot do, because the United States has almost unlimited borrowing capacity. The Indian government does not. Even recently, when the government tried to float some bonds, they were not fully successful. Now, about the inflation issue, I do worry about it a little bit, although I should say right now, inflation worry should be less than usual. First of all, our Food Corporation of India stocks are overfull, and we have a good crop which is going to be harvested and make that stock quite enough. Secondly, we have a very comfortable foreign exchange stock right now, but more than $500 million. Thirdly, the international oil prices are low. So altogether, I think the economy may be able to tolerate a bit more inflation than it usually is. But unfortunately, because of the lockdown, there have been supply bottlenecks. So already, if I'm not mistaken, the inflation rate has already reached about 6% or so, which is beyond the target inflation of the Reserve Bank. But I have a feeling, but at the same time, I believe that with the harvesting coming up in the next couple of months, prices probably will go down. And also, as the lockdown is being opened, some of the supply bottlenecks will be clear. So the inflation situation may get better in the next couple of months. But I think we should not just depend on monetizing, printing money, basically, for funding the universal basic income. I have, in most of my op-eds, I have given a calculation of how to raise the money, apart from, of course, printing money. Number one, and this is most people are not aware, in the Indian budget, if you take the central budget plus the state budgets, a very large percentage are given as subsidies. And now we have studies showing that these subsidies, a major part of these subsidies, are given to the better off, the rich and the middle class. I call them regressive subsidies, subsidies that are going more to the better off. And recently, I think some people in the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy have estimated the amount of subsidies that go to the better off. They call it non-merit subsidies. And the latest estimate, and this estimate is for 2015-16, is that 5.7% of GDP is given out as these regressive non-merit subsidies. I think the time has come to take much of it and give it as part of universal basic income, number one. Number two, if you look at the central budget, it's not very clear in the budget itself, but in the appendix, you will see another very large amount is given away in what is called in the budget revenues foregone. What are these revenues foregone? If you follow it through, you will see that these are essentially tax concessions to companies. Now, what is the total amount? We do not have estimates for the state budget, but the central budget alone, revenues foregone in the form of tax concessions come to about 6% of GDP. Now, it's possible some of these tax concessions are necessary, but I can tell you some of it is not. So let's suppose we take out of the 6% half. So that gives you 3%. So I've already told you 5.7% of regressive subsidies. And now the revenues foregone, I made just one small correction. The revenues foregone is not 6%. It used to be 6%. Now it's 5%. So let's take half of that. Half of that is 2.5% of GDP. So add that to 5.7. So that comes to 8.2%. I want to raise another 1.8% to make a rounded sum of 10%, another 1.8% of fresh taxes. India is one of the very few countries. The rich will ask you not to believe it, but India is one of the very few countries in which the rich are undertaxed. For example, India is one of the very few countries in which there is zero taxation of inheritance. India is one of the very few countries now, zero taxation of wealth. India is one of the very few countries, agricultural income, zero taxation. And then very light taxation of long-term capital gains, very light taxation of urban property. So all of this, if you take together, and then I'll mention one other somewhat novel tax. I'll come to that in a minute. So I think there's a lot of scope for fresh taxation. And the new taxation that I have in mind is not just for India, I think for the whole world, including the United States, is that with the big tech companies, they're making billions of dollars of money by taking yours and mine data, individual data, selling them to the advertisers. So there's a lot of discussion that United States is that the big tech companies have to buy those data, our data from us, because they're getting our data, selling it to the advertisers, making billions of dollars. My suggestion would be that the government may impose a tax on the big tech companies to essentially get this free data that they're getting, which they're selling to free data from the citizens, selling to the advertisers and making so much money. They should give back a part of that money to the government, and then through the government, part of basic income back to the citizens. So I should also include that. Now, the estimates that I made, barring this last point I'm just making, I have not made any estimate. So let me ignore that. For the other taxes that I mentioned, altogether, very easily, you can have 2% of GDP. So if you add all this up, easily you can have, easily, not politically. It's politically, it's not easy because the rich do not want to give up their low taxation position. So I'm saying that it is possible, potentially possible, to get about 10% of GDP. Now, as soon as you see that 10%, then I should say that there are other claimants to that 10%. So, for example, in India, and this is the COVID crisis makes it so apparent, India needs to spend a lot more on health, on public health. India is one of the lowest spenders on public health in the whole world. So what I would do is 10% of GDP, I want to divide it into 4 parts. Number 1, health. Number 2, more money for education. Number 3, infrastructure. And number 4, universal basic income. Suppose you, on these 4, you divide it equally. So out of 10% of GDP, you give 2.5% to universal basic income. Even that means, and I've made some back of the envelope calculation, even if you give 2.5% of GDP, rest given to health, education, and infrastructure, even if you give 2.5% of GDP to universal basic income, you can then give about 20,000 rupees per year to each family. All of India, universally, you give 20,000 rupees to each family. So that way, people who say we don't have the money, I think I don't ever believe that, because essentially, when they say we don't have the money, they essentially say that we should let go the rich to enjoy the low taxation and the regressive subsidies they are enjoying. I have 1 or 2 other points, but I can come back later.
Okay, thanks, Professor Bhatt. That was pretty meaningful, and I think we just heard from him talking about how 10% of India's GDP can be kept aside for very essential requirements that India really needs right now. And he spoke about infrastructure. He spoke about how the public spend on India for healthcare is the lowest in the world, and also spoke about the fact that about 2.5% can be taken out from that 10% kitty specifically for UBI. I want to understand from you that we have spoken about what really is UBI, what is going to be the impact on inflation, how we're going to fund it. Now we take the discussion forward as to how do you implement UBI? How do you implement such a large-scale experiment on this country? And I think keeping in mind what Professor Bhatt also mentioned, that the rich have to be taxed fairly and the subsidies being given to the well-off, he's calling them regressive in nature.
Right. So Shrija, I have a little deviation there in my opinion. So let me just share that first. I think the first key point I would like to make there is this concept of the government struggling to borrow money and India not having the capability to do that vis-a-vis the United States as an example. I think that I don't agree with that concept. And let me just give you the factual objective information to support that. The Indian government can sell securities like bonds and treasury bills to the RBI. There is no restriction for the government in doing that. When they do that and the RBI provides the funding to the government, that is brand new money being created in the system without needing to have a dependency on any third party. They can do it today, they're authorized to do it today, and that is the mechanism being used in the Western world today and has been for a while, including the 2008 crisis. India has the exact same option to do it. The only concern when you do it is the potential impact of that new money creation or the theoretical term of printing new money, right? That's the only concern. So the first point I want to make is the Indian government in support in planning with the RBI can actually create an unlimited amount of money. Now, obviously, you have to be very careful when doing that because you do not want a situation that could cause hyperinflation. And to just not to digress, but to just give you a metric here, I mean, if you look at the most spoken example of a hyperinflation, which is Zimbabwe, in the early 2000s, they printed or they created 300 to 400% new money in a period of 2 to 3 years, right? If you do that, obviously you're going to trigger something catastrophic. We are not even talking about those numbers. We are just talking about very basic needs. So I would say, firstly, I don't think there is any limit to the government for the creation of that money. They don't have any restrictions. They don't need to borrow from any third party. They can borrow from the RBI, right? That's the first point. The second point, again, what I would like to explain is, I think there is a lack of understanding on the source of money or money creation in any economy, right? So let me share a quick data point to support that. If you look, comparing India and the United States is always challenging, because it's comparing two boys who grew up in a village, or two children who grew up in a village. One is the poor man's child and the other is the rich man's child. But let's compare equal entities. Let's compare India with China. In 1990, the GDP of China was 360 billion. The GDP of India was 320 billion. The money supply in China was 260 billion. The money supply in India was 140 billion. This is 1990. We were almost the same. In fact, we had half the money. Now you go to 2019, which is about 30 years after the fact, right? Just before the COVID crisis. The situation in China is they have a GDP of 14.5 trillion. India is 2.8 trillion. The money supply in China is 28 trillion, double their GDP. Money supply in India is 2.6 trillion. All right. Now, you have to ask the basic logical question. So you started this discussion, Shrija, by saying we got to look at it from a first principle standpoint. So let's apply first principles. Why are we looking at basic assumptions here? Let's question those assumptions and go back to first principles. And the first principles question is, where did that money come from, both in China and in India? If they only had 260 billion in 1990 and today they have 28 trillion, where did that money come from? A comeback to that might be that came from foreign direct investment. But if you look at the data, the foreign direct investment in China in the last 30 years is about 4 trillion only. So 24 trillion was created from somewhere. And the answer is it was created from nothing. And I'll come back to exactly the mechanism that was used to create it. But now let me just touch on.
Professor Vardhan, you want to say something?
No, I couldn't hear it. Yeah, now it's okay.
All right. So I was just saying, so that was the situation in China, right? The money supply was just 260 billion, and now it's 2.8 trillion. And I was saying the FDI was just 4 trillion. Now, if the FDI was just 4 trillion, where did the 24 odd trillion come from? That's the question. If you go by first principles, if you look at India, we had 140 billion of money supply in 1990. Today, our money supply is 2.6 trillion, and our total FDI in the net FDI in the last 30 odd years is just over 500 billion. So the question again is, where did that extra money come from in India? So that's the first principles question, right? So now let's look at the data. Where did the money come from? I would relate that to the concept of money creation in the economy. If you look at the Western economies, 97% of the money supply is credit. 3% is money created by the central banks. In China, 96% of the money supply is credit. 4% is money printed or created by the central bank. In India, 85% of our money supply is credit. And when I say credit, it's actually driven through bank loans. And 15% is money that the RBI created. These are all factual numbers that I'm laying out on the table here, right? So the simple question I'm asking is, when you look at these numbers, the question is, where did the money come from? And the money came from banks making loans. So when a bank makes a loan, whether it's a personal loan, a credit card loan, an auto loan, or a housing loan, that is brand new money being created in the system, because the banks have no restrictions. They do have some restrictions when you look at the cash reserve ratios that the RBI mandates, but for all practical purposes, they do not have a restriction. And just to support that with the data point, if you just look at the top 10 banks in India, only the 10 banks in India have a capacity to lend today of more than 20 lakh crores. I'm just throwing that number up there because it matches the published stimulus number that the government of India mentioned, which actually, is not real money. It's just support programs. But as far as the banks are concerned, they can create 20 crore of new money in the system today with the current structures. Now, the reason I'm giving you that feedback is, firstly, there is no funding problem, right? Now, the second part of that, I just want to, before I conclude on this key point I'm trying to make, is that when you really look at this data, you understand that we can create the money. Now, when you understand that we can create the money, the only concern is, are we going to inflate pricing and dilute everybody? And that's where I'm going back to my earlier point, that as long as you're creating money and in parallel you're increasing productivity of basic goods and services, you're not going to dilute folks, right? Because in every way you're going to create new money in the economy, just in line with what has happened in China. And China literally created 75 times in the last 30 years more money than India has created out of nowhere. So I think we are really tying ourselves down, or we are shooting ourselves in the foot in this quagmire we have created about how the money supply works. So I wanted to say that first, and then get to your point about the implementation. Again, let's get into the details of the Aadhaar program.
Professor Vardhan, you want to say something?
I'll come after he finishes. I have something to say. Yes.
Okay.
Right. So on the implementation side, on the Aadhaar program, I think India is one of the strongest technology infrastructures in the world today that we can be proud of, right? With the technology running the Aadhaar program, and more importantly, the enrollment that Aadhaar has. For all practical purposes, the Aadhaar program already has universal enrollment in India. Like I said, we have a population of 1.35 billion. The Aadhaar enrollment is 1.26 billion. The gap of close to 100 million is citizens or children below the age of 5 who are not eligible for the Aadhaar program, and so can be excluded even from a UBI standpoint. So from an implementation standpoint, you're going to have almost universal coverage. But for stragglers who are not part of the Aadhaar program, if the government announced UBI tomorrow, then what can be done is they can be just provided arrears for what was owed to them by the government by the time they get enrolled in 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, or 6 months. So they're not going to panic, right? And we're not going to have long lines out there in front of Aadhaar offices once this program is announced, like we saw with the demonetization situation. So from an implementation standpoint, the government can do direct cash transfers or fund transfers into bank accounts linked to Aadhaar. And the beautiful thing in India is more than 80% of our population already has bank accounts. And then if you specifically look at the Jan Dhan accounts, that was, again, a great policy from the current government. We have almost 400 million citizens on the Jan Dhan accounts already. So firstly, 80% are going to be taken care of because the money can be transferred directly to their bank account. For the remaining 20%, which in India is still a significant number, the money can be made accessible through any channel that the government controls, which is the banks, of course, but also the post offices, any government entity or semi-government entity, because the Aadhaar, the beautiful aspect, or I think the most powerful aspect of Aadhaar is it's a biometric identity verification system, which means anybody authorized in the country can identify a citizen who's enrolled in the Aadhaar through their biometrics. And if the policy is you get your UBI once a month, then anywhere in India you go to collect your UBI, there's no issues in getting it, because the system that can disperse the UBI can validate if you already received UBI for that particular month. This is not based on any identity document that can be scanned and copied and spoofed. Because it's based on biometrics, I think we have one of the most powerful platforms in the world. So I would almost use the term that the implementation honestly is trivial. And I'm speaking about it with that term because I am in that industry, right? We intimately understand how you put in place such technology systems. And India doesn't really need to do much because the infrastructure and the technology already exists to support Aadhaar. As all of you would have experienced, if you look at the Know Your Customer or the KYC norms to get a new mobile phone connection or a new data connection, you just use your thumbprint and that's it. You don't need to go through an extensive eligibility process of providing documentation and identity documentation. Your biometrics lets you through. And the same would apply with implementing UBI as well. So I think that's just my clarification on how the implementation can be put in place.
Professor Vardhan, you wanted to say something on two or three key aspects we discussed here. Yeah.
Yes. Let me go back to the financing. I'll spend 1 minute and then I'll talk about the implementation issue. I think I agree with Mr. Tarakan about the money printing issue in the sense that I think the government of India and the Reserve Bank of India have been much too financially conservative on the issue of money printing, particularly now when many other countries are doing it. And India has been particularly stingy. And in some sense, while our lockdown has one of the world's harshest, our economic program has been one of the most stingy programs. China has been referred to. Chinese have already spent 5% of GDP on the relief and stimulus programs, whereas ours is more like 1%. So I think we have been, the government has been much too conservative, financially conservative. There is a lot of scope for borrowing from the Reserve Bank. But I do worry a bit more compared to Mr. Tarakan, the issue of inflation, because already, as I said, the inflation rate is about 6%, which is beyond the RBI target rate. But as I said before, probably the inflation is going to go down a little. But in India, the major problem of when you print money, the corresponding productivity improvement, Indian economy, for various reasons, have a lot of inelasticities and rigidities. And those cannot be solved overnight. And as long as those rigidities and inelasticities remain, a mere demand expansion with those in production inelasticity, production will not go up immediately or even in the intermediate run. And to the extent there's a mismatch between demand and supply, there will be inflation problem. So I do worry about the inflation problem a little bit more compared to Mr. Tarakan. Let me go to the implementation issues. I think there are two kinds of implementation problem. One is political and the other is administrative. Political, particularly because, particularly if you go by my earlier statement that I think just not money printing, you need to have some taxes and reduction of regressive subsidies, and most of them will be on the rich. And the rich in India are sufficiently powerful, rich and middle class, who are by Indian standards very rich. They are politically powerful. So they are not going to easily give up on the subsidies they are enjoying now. And they are not going to easily allow, they'll be lobby hard against any fresh taxes. So politically, it will be difficult. But having said that, let me say, crisis is also the time to do something new. So if there is resistance, yes, there will be political resistance, but crisis is the time to back or soften down that resistance. So that will be my point about political implementation issue, that now is the time to do it, if the government really wants to do it. Administratively, sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry, Professor Bardhan, I thought you had ended. Please carry on. Yeah, sorry.
No. Now I talked about the political implementation issue. Now let me talk about the administrative implementation issue. There are two or three things. I'm also a little less optimistic on the administratively easy implementation that Mr. Tarakan has talked about. I think it's not so much the other issue, it's the bank account issue. Yes, the data is about 80% of Indians have bank accounts. But if you really look into them, almost half of them are inactive accounts, dormant accounts. Some of those accounts have been artificially created by bank officials. They put 1 rupee and then just to fill a target, so many bank accounts have been created. Much of them are not really active accounts. Secondly, well, actually, I can also add one more point, which I've referred to before. Even the Jan Dhan accounts, there has been a big service done by the whole team from Yale University, mostly a team led by Indian origin economists, found that even the Jan Dhan accounts, which people, those by government data, they have the Jan Dhan accounts. But when they looked into it, 1/3 of them, and this is, I'm talking about rural India, not urban India, 1/3 of Jan Dhan rural accounts, the poor, 1/3 of the poor did not have the Jan Dhan accounts. So there are a lot of lapses in the bank account issue, which will not be immediately solved. To reach the people to have the universal basic income deposited in their bank accounts, to be really universal, it will take quite a few years. It will not be immediately done, but there are intermediate solutions. Meanwhile, when I don't have a bank account or I don't have an active bank account, there are other ways of reaching people. For example, banking agents. If you don't have a bank account, banking agents can go, you pay banking agents, they go and give the money to you. Or use India's large number of post offices, where if you don't have a bank account, you go to the post office. Just as, for example, you send money by money order in post office. Government, if the government wants to, can send money by money order. So these are intermediate steps the government can take if not everybody or a large number of people do not have bank accounts. So it's a solvable problem. It's not an insuperable problem. The other implementation issue is a lot of people are worried that since we usually think of basic income as a money amount, with inflation, as I said, it's now about 6%. Some years it's more than 6%. So the real value of the basic income is going to go down. So you need to index it. And that is another implementation issue. And it is possible to implement it. For example, when we pay out pension, the government pays out pensions, there is a dearness allowance, which is a kind of indexing it. So it is the universal basic income needs to be indexed. Thirdly, the last issue that I want to mention, even if at the beginning we don't have the full amount of money, we don't have to give it to everybody. For just as a trial basis, why don't you give it only to women? So that would be half the population. So start with giving only to women, and then figure out what are the problems that you face in reaching out to all the women of India, and then gradually move to the whole population. So these are the kind of implementation issues that come to my mind for now. Yes.
Thank you, Professor Vardhan. Yeah, Vinod, I want to make a point, and I also must say that we don't have much time left. We have one last round of questioning also left, and we have to conclude. So, gentlemen, we'll just try to sort of get to that quickly. Yeah.
Right. I think funding is a key question. That's why I wanted to just provide some supporting information to just complement what Professor Vardhan says. I think all the concerns raised are very valid concerns. But I think the most empowering thing in India is we have the solutions uniquely in India for them. So let me just clarify that. Firstly, I don't think we should try to take away any of the existing social benefits, because that's going to create conflict. If you start touching existing systems like Manrega, or if you start touching existing PDS systems or existing social benefit systems, you're going to have a revolt in the country, right? Look at the current situation with the farming new regulations. It's actually very clearly beneficial to the farmers, but you still have a revolt against it. So when you take something away, there's going to be a problem. So I would almost say don't take anything away, and we don't need to take anything away, right? Because let's avoid an unnecessary revolt or a rebellion with the population. Let's just give them something brand new, because even when you give them something brand new, it's not going to be an impact. That's the first point. The second point is this question about the dormant accounts touching Jandan and also touching Aadhaar. So the important thing to understand here is when you look at the technology behind the Aadhaar program, let's take you as an example, Shrija. Let's say there is a dormant account in your name, and 3,000 rupees was transferred into that account by the government, and now you're waiting for the UBI and you don't get it. Now, if you go and say, listen, where is my money? Because you're identified through your Aadhaar biometrics, they can see, oh, your money was transferred to XYZ account, but they can now debit their account and now give you cash at a bank, because you can only get that once. If you try to go to the next bank, they'll see, sorry, your biometric Aadhaar authentication shows that you were already dispersed the money. So even if you send it or transfer it to a bank account, but later there is a realization when you raise your hand or escalate the issue that you've not received the money, that money is sitting in the dormant account, it can be debited and credited back to you like withdrawing it from an ATM. So that's the first part about addressing the enrollment issue with dormant Aadhaar accounts. The last thing I want to talk again is coming back to the inflation concern. If you look at the CPI or the consumer market inflation statistics, right? Today that's going up because there is a supply issue with the draconian lockdown that we've seen in India, right? Everything had to shut down. So it's obviously, if you don't make stuff, there is no stuff. right? So I'm surprised that it's only 6%. I would have thought it should be more, but that's a temporary issue. It's not a permanent issue because the supply side is very robust in India. And again, I don't think we need to concern ourselves with inflation in food and basic essentials because there is a limit to the demand there, and 90% is already consuming food. So it's not like they're all going to consume more food, right? So I don't think the new money creation directly tagged to inflation in food and basic essentials is as big a concern. So I just wanted to just complement those few points in support of the concerns that Professor Balkan raised.
Okay, so we spoke about
just make one. Can I make just one? Two quick points, not more than a minute. One is that in my scheme also, I'm not taking away any of the existing programs. In my scheme, all the existing programs remain, but in my scheme, the rich will have to contribute a bit more, giving up some subsidies and some taxes. And the only last point that I want to make, one other problem that I have not talked about before in the banking account issue is that a very significant part of the population in different parts of India live so remote that there is no bank within I think the data that I saw, a significant percentage of people do not live within 6 kilometers of a bank. To go to the bank itself is a big issue. And that even if they have an account. So that's the reason I mentioned the issue of banking agents so the people don't have to go to the banks. The banking agents come to people to their home, and post offices are more widely distributed than the banks. So that's why I think the post offices should also be used. So let me stop there.
Okay, I think I heard from both of you. It was a very meaningful, insightful discussion that, the kind of approaches that we can take to fund the UBI program. Both of you, there's so much consensus on why it has to be as universal as possible, how technology can be a big enabler on this, and some new ideas also came to the fore about taxing the rich, and perhaps toying with the idea of why not tax the big billion-dollar tech companies just so hugely funded and actually selling our data, our private data. Also to Vinod's point on what he mentioned, that perhaps inflation is a temporary concern. There are larger problems to tend to right now, and things can also be solved through proper understanding of money creation. These are very interesting ideas coming to the fore. But the last round of questioning, really, gentlemen, is the critiquing of UBI. There's some bit of commentary coming from critiques is that perhaps it can actually damage the already existing very fragile social security structure that we have in India, and perhaps can also encourage wasteful spending. I want to understand from both of you what really would be your arguments to sort of silence the critiques right now, because honestly it looks like that the time for UBI, if at all it was there, is right now. The time has really come. Perhaps begin with you, Vinod, and get to Professor Bardhan on this. Yeah.
Right, and that's a valid question that anybody raises, right? And everybody raises about UBI, because what I have heard very often is, where is the money going to come from, and why should we give free money to anybody, right? But we do so many things for the social benefits already, like free healthcare, the Manrega. We have so many, the PDS. So it's already happening. The question is the leakage and the wastage when you're trying to implement those mechanisms. So I would say that the key concern that is being raised about the negative issues of UBI is again driven by a lack of understanding of how the system or the solution can work, right? And I don't think, look at the data, Shrija. There are pilot programs implemented all over the world, including in India over the last 10 years. The one in India, which was in Madhya Pradesh in 2011, had phenomenal results. The UBI that they validated with, I think, tens of thousands of individuals in that program, this was funded by the UNICEF and was implemented by the SEVA program, the SEVA social entity in India. And look at the data supporting those results. So if you look at that data, you'll see There was a significant improvement in hygiene in those villages. There was a significant improvement in healthcare because people are spending money in pharmacies to buy medication. There was a significant improvement in child education because they were not needing to get forced into child labor. They could afford to go to the schools. There was significant improvement in nutrition index, etc. Now, there's a fringe that will say people will use this money and go and buy alcohol or get into other abusive practices. But please understand that the money we are talking about is insignificant. Everybody needs to feed themselves. So they'll feed themselves first. And if you look at the other population that can get swayed into these abusive practices, they already have the money to do that. The folks who don't have money to eat are not going to go into abusive practices. And even if they do, there'll be such a small little fringe that we don't need to worry about it. So I really think the data, the good thing here is we don't need to speculate or provide opinions. There is valid data to support the fact that there really is no meaningful negative out of implementing a UBI program.
Okay.
I just want to add to that, essentially supplement that. Essentially, I would also endorse it. This worry that people will waste it in drugs and alcohol, etc. There is no evidence. There's a lot of studies all over the world, including the Madhya Pradesh study that was just referred to. We don't have any evidence on that. The other worry people have that, oh, people will become lazy. This is actually a rich people idea because they think poor people are lazy. If you ask me, the poor people in India are overworked. In fact, if they can work a little less, particularly the women, I would be happier if they work a little less. They are overworked. So I don't think we should worry about either the abuse of the money, they usually make it to good use, or that they will become lazy. On the issue of the system is fragile, the financial system is fragile, again, I think it's a matter of timing. The things like taxes, etc., that I mentioned is in intermediate term. Right now is not the right time to have too many taxes, but in the beginning, so it has to be phased. In the beginning, it has to be more borrowing, and over time, as the economy revives, then the kind of taxes that I've talked about. So it's a bit of phasing that is necessary. Our system is not more fragile than other countries. And other countries, most other countries facing the crisis have done much more in terms of giving to the poor. India's program is one of the, not merely the lockdown has been one of the most harshest. Our program to meet the crisis has been one of the stingiest. So I think there's a lot of scope for being a little more generous for the masses of people who are suffering both from the health crisis and the economic crisis. Let me stop there.
Okay, gentlemen, we spoke on quite a few aspects of UBI here and really had the first principles approach in dissecting the UBI issue. We began with what really is UBI, how to fund it, how to implement it, what can be the various solutions to this entire big mammoth question in front of us on the funding aspect. We also got down to critiquing of it. My last question really is the playbook for UBI. If there exists one, have we seen some rollouts or these large successful experimentation happening in other parts of the world? I was reading a report which said that perhaps we should look at Canada or Finland. Some of these large scale experiments have rolled out there. I also want to understand that this idea of universal basic income is as old as when Martin Luther King Jr. actually said that we have to abolish poverty completely. And during that point of time, he actually said that was guaranteed income. It keeps coming back in various names, shapes, sizes, and forms. Professor Vardhan, my last sort of question to you, what would be the national blueprint for rolling out UBI? Give us like 2 or 3 key steps or the playbook that could be followed, then get on to Vinod, and that will be a wrap up for this amazing discussion today.
So you want me to go first?
Yeah.
Let me say that the UBI is much older than Martin Luther King, actually. UBI, the idea of UBI is 500 years old. It was first proposed in 1500 something, 1516 or something. Anyway, it's a very old idea, and a lot of people have given much thought to it. But even in developing countries, and not to speak of Finland, Canada, etc., it has been tried out now. In fact, one of the world's largest programs, experimental programs, is going on in Kenya. So they are giving a very substantial sum of basic income. This is being done by the NGO called Give Directly. They are doing it in 40 villages in Kenya, much bigger scale than the Madhya Pradesh pilot program that was done by Seva and others. And all the evidence that shows the people are not misusing the money. The question really is, can we sustain it fiscally, financially, etc.? And that is why we talked about those other issues. But I think in order to make these things plausible, we should start with experimental programs. Let's start it in a pilot program. In fact, one of the small states in India, Sikkim, I don't know whether they have done anything, but last year, before the election, 2019 election, Sikkim announced that if the ruling party in Sikkim comes to power, they're going to implement universal basic income. That is an example that maybe we should start it in some states. And in the beginning, if there's not enough money, give it only to women, as I said. So start as pilot programs, experimental programs, and learn from the problems that we are facing, and then make it gradually more general. So that will be all I'd say at this point.
Okay, Vinod, last concluding remarks. Professor Bardhan is saying that perhaps the time is to have small experiments or pilot programs and then take it more general, or perhaps do it on a mass scale. What is your view there? So last concluding. Yeah.
Right. So I would say that we've already done those pilots. We've already done those experiments, right? I mean, this will be a leadership issue. I mean, if the leadership wants to push it off, nobody's going to say no to this. They'll launch another pilot program, and then we'll push it out another 5 years. I think what we really need to be doing is, I think India needs to be leading the way here. If you look at the Aadhaar program, I have been referencing the Aadhaar program in the West, where they are like just completely amazed at that universal identification capability driven by the government on biometrics. Now, there is, of course, the fearful side of that on the privacy side, but let's be real. Come on, we've had pictures and photographs pasted on any form and application during our lifetime. So you don't have privacy, and you can't hide if you've done something wrong. And we are all democratic countries, right? So the biometric authentication program, we have been the leaders in that in the world. I think nobody really knows what's happening in China. They are more advanced on the technology side, but outside of China, I think we have the most robust system. We have the infrastructure. We've already shown the leadership. I really think the government is missing an opportunity here if they don't show the leadership and really move forward and execute on this program like countrywide. Because if you look at the data and if you look at the history of experiments and pilots on this subject, there really is nothing to lose. Now look on the upside. You're talking about the playbook for the government. You have the infrastructure in place. You can execute. You have the data about who needs to get it because it's universal. It's everybody. Now think about the upside. The upside, honestly, being in India, I would say, I would almost say on the intangible side, we will be building temples in the name of our prime minister across the country if they do it, right? So I don't think the issue is the political leadership. I think the issue is with the advisors to the politicians, right? Because my problem, and I've seen this in many of my interactions, is there is a lack of understanding on some of these key subjects. And you're always safer as a bureaucrat when you don't do anything. Because if you try to do anything or if you try to do something, you are not the hero if it succeeds because the politician might take the credit. But if it fails, you are going to be, your head is on the line. So that fear factor is what holds things back. And the politicians, they don't seem to be able to take the leadership to override the bureaucrats. And that's what's holding us back. So I would strongly say, let's go for those temples all across the country, get this done.
Okay, I see Professor Vardhan smiling and completely being in consensus with what Vinod just mentioned, that it's time to take the leadership and perhaps take those big plunges. and what is really holding the government back. Thank you, gentlemen. It was a wonderful conversation. We dwelled on quite a few topics, and we really approached the UBI topic with the first principles approach and dissected it with all those 5 prisms. My last question, and I usually do a rapid fire, but it's such a touchy and a meaningful topic. I want to understand from both of you, which I refer to in my intro remarks, that this entire site of, watching the laborers, undertaking these perilous journeys on foot in inhumane conditions with disgraceful blight in India. What was your first reaction when you saw the picture or when you saw this on television? I'll open this up with you, Vinod, and then go on to Professor Bardhan. Like one simple sentence, what was your first reaction for this?
From my side, Shrija, it's extreme frustration, right? Because from my perspective, there is absolutely no reason for it to happen. And I can give you a first-hand experience because we have a construction business. We had close to 100 plus of these, North Indian migrant labor forces working here. We put in place basic support, even though the work had stopped and they get paid daily wages. We had put in place daily basic support so that they don't need to worry about their existence. And for the first 2 months, nobody really left. Then we did see, because the work was still not starting because of the lockdown, they were leaving, but they were not leaving because of financial or economic issues. They were just leaving because they saw it as an opportunity to go back home. And also the fear, stoked through social media about the negatives of this COVID virus, right? But so I think it was extreme frustration because there was no reason for it. And it's, again, this bureaucratic situation in India where the reaction from the government could have been so much better, so much faster. It was held back. And honestly, watching that is what prompted me to try and get the word out that, things could be a lot better. And then I've been publishing content around that ever since.
Okay, Professor Bardhan.
I think it was a matter of national shame what happened. This is on March 24, a lockdown was announced, 4 hours notice. All the migrants were trapped. They lost their job. They lost their home. No food. Only the NGOs, the government did not provide them food or shelter. Only the NGOs, some NGOs provided them. Same year, March 24, same day, South Africa announced a lockdown. But they gave 4 days time, not 4 hours, 4 days time, so that all the migrant laborers could go back home. So this is the most callous part of our government policy. So what we did to the migrants. And I also thought, and this is my last sentence, I also thought if we had universal basic income, at least they could get that income there. They did not have any food. They did not have any shelter, no cash. So universal basic income is, again, shows how important it was, even for these millions of migrant laborers. Let me stop there.
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for putting your time and energy to this. Till the time I see you next, goodbye and good luck. And here's wishing you and yours safety during this time of lockdown. Please follow all the protocols. And thank you so much for joining us and sharing those insights with us. I'm sure it will be very meaningful to our readers and audiences. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome.